3 weeks after they moved me to the basement, a moving truck rolled into the driveway just after sunrise. Long before Melissa came down in her silk robe expecting coffee in the kitchen, she had started calling hers. And when she looked out the front window and saw strangers stepping onto the porch with folders in their hands, the color drained from her face in a way I had only seen once before. When truth arrives without warning, Daniel came running from upstairs, asking what was happening. And I set my teacup down and told him the house had closed at 9 o'clock the day before. The funds were already wired, and the new owners would take possession by noon. For a moment neither of them spoke, as if language itself had abandoned them. Then Melissa laughed, that brittle little laugh she used when cornered, and said I was bluffing, that I could never sell the family home without their knowledge. And that was when the couple stepped inside with the real estate attorney and greeted me by name. I watched Melissa's expression collapse when the attorney handed her a copy of the occupancy notice and explained she and Daniel had 30 days to vacate. No extensions, no appeals, because as he calmly reminded them, the property had always been held in my sole name under a survivorship deed my late husband and I arranged decades ago. A detail Melissa had somehow never bothered to verify while measuring drapes for my bedroom. Daniel turned on her then, asking why she had pushed renovations, why she had borrowed against her personal credit assuming an inheritance she did not own, and in that instant the whole scheme began unraveling in plain sight. The buyers had discovered, through inspection records, several unauthorized improvements Melissa ordered under false representations of ownership, and because permits had been filed using statements she signed, she became personally liable for tens of thousands in corrective costs. The Homeowners Association, already angered by her attempt to force through illegal exterior changes, moved forward with complaints that had her reputation in that neighborhood finished before sunset. Even the church women who once praised her care for me stopped taking her calls when they learned she had moved a 72-year-old widow beside a furnace, while turning the master suite into a sitting room for herself. She had wanted social standing, and lost it. She had wanted my equity, and buried herself in debt. She had wanted to make me small, and exposed herself instead. Daniel, shaken and pale, asked how I could do this to my own son. And I looked him in the eye and told him the day he let his wife move his mother into a basement for convenience. He had already answered that question. I gave him no speech about forgiveness, because some lessons arrive better in silence. I had arranged a furnished cottage overlooking a lake 90 miles north, paid in full from the sale, with enough left invested to secure the rest of my life, and for the first time since my husband died, every decision before me belonged to me alone. Before leaving, I walked upstairs one last time into the room they had claimed, touched the window frame my husband installed with his own hands, and closed that chapter without grief. As I reached the front door, Melissa hissed that I had ruined them, and I smiled because at last she understood ruin was not what happens when a woman loses a bedroom, but what happens when greed mistakes kindness for weakness. 2 months later, I heard they had moved into a cramped rental after selling jewelry and a second car to settle debts, while Daniel took a second job to cover legal fees tied to those false filings, and every person who once admired Melissa now knew exactly why. Meanwhile, I slept each night in a second-floor bedroom with morning light over the water. No footsteps above me, no whispers outside my door, no one deciding where I belonged. They moved me to the basement thinking they had pushed me downward, but they only reminded me I still own the stairs. And in the end, I did not fight for control, I exercised it. I did not reclaim my place in that house. I removed everyone who forgot whose house it was. They thought they were relocating an old woman for convenience. 3 weeks later, I sold the house, dismantled their fantasy, and walked away with every ounce of dignity, every legal right, and every final word. It'll be easier for everyone if you sleep downstairs now, my daughter-in-law said over pot roast on a Tuesday night, as if she were offering me a kindness instead of an exile, and my son Daniel nodded without looking at me, cutting his meat into careful little squares the way he used to when he was hiding something as a boy. I remember the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking louder than usual, and I remember understanding, in that quiet, awful instant, that they had discussed my future. Without me, I did not argue, and maybe that was their first mistake. I'm glad you're here and stay with me until the end, because what happened after they moved me to the basement changed every rule my family thought they understood. My husband Richard and I bought that house in 1978 for $86,000, a drafty colonial on a tree-lined street outside Hartford, and over 40 years we restored every inch ourselves, room by room, paycheck by paycheck, until it held more memory than lumber. The master bedroom upstairs had been ours since Gerald Ford was in office. With blue wallpaper, Richard hung crooked the first time and refused to redo because he said imperfection gave a home character. After he passed, I slept on his side of the bed for almost a year because his absence felt less sharp there. So when Melissa said the basement would be safer, because the stairs were becoming too much at 72, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I had climbed those stairs carrying laundry baskets heavier than either of them had ever lifted. After dinner, I walked upstairs and found my dresser drawers already half emptied. My winter sweaters had been folded into cardboard boxes marked lower level. My bedside lamp was unplugged, and on the hallway bench sat a swatch book Melissa had been using to choose paint colors for what she had started calling the upstairs suite. No one had asked permission because permission was no longer part of their plan. Daniel followed me to the bedroom and said they only wanted me comfortable, that the basement room had a television and a reclining chair and even its own bathroom, as though comfort could replace dignity. I looked at my wedding portrait over the mantel and felt something cold settle inside me. Not grief exactly, but clarity. The basement smelled faintly of detergent and furnace dust, and a narrow bed had been made beside shelves of holiday decorations and old paint cans. Melissa chirped that they had added a quilt to make it cozy. Cozy, she said, while my bedroom upstairs was being measured for new curtains. I ran my hand along the concrete wall and said nothing. Silence unsettles selfish people more than protest ever does. That night I lay awake listening to footsteps overhead, hearing them move through the room that had been mine, hearing drawers open, hearing laughter, and each sound was like a small nail sealing something shut inside me. Around 2 in the morning I rose, put on my robe, and stood beside the basement window looking at the dark lawns silvered by moonlight, and that was where the thought came. So calm it frightened me. They believe they moved me down. They do not yet understand what can still be moved by the woman who owns the deed. The next morning, before either of them woke, I made coffee, opened a yellow legal pad, and wrote one name at the top of the page: my attorney. The attorney called me back before noon, his voice as measured as ever. And when I told him I wanted to review my deed and trust documents, he did not sound surprised, which unsettled me more than if he had. Harold Benton had handled Richard's estate 12 years earlier and had known enough about families to recognize the tone of a woman who had crossed from hurt into decision. He asked if I could come by the office Thursday, and I said yes, though I told Daniel I had a routine doctor appointment because already I understood some plans survive only in silence. Life in the basement settled into a strange theater of small humiliations. Melissa began speaking to me in the bright, careful tone people use with children and cashiers, asking whether I needed help remembering my pills, though I had managed my own blood pressure medication for 20 years. She moved my cereal from the kitchen pantry to a plastic bin downstairs, so I would not need to make the trip. And when neighbors stopped by, she described the basement room as a lovely in-law suite, as if language could disguise what had happened. But what stayed with me were not the large insults, only the tiny ones. The framed family photographs disappeared from the upstairs hallway and reappeared in Melissa's den arranged around her monogrammed candles. My late husband's leather chair was sent to storage because it clashed with a rug she ordered online. Even Sunday breakfast changed, with Daniel carrying plates upstairs to eat in what used to be my room while I sat alone near the washing machine listening to pipes tick in the walls. People imagine betrayal arrives as thunder, but often it is only 100 teaspoons of cold water. Thursday, I drove to Harold's office in a rain so fine it looked like mist over the interstate, and when he laid the documents before me, his finger stopped on a clause Richard had insisted remain untouched. The property had passed entirely to me, free of contingent claims, with full rights of sale, transfer, or charitable conveyance at my sole discretion. Harold looked over his glasses and asked if someone had been pressuring me, and I said not exactly, then told him about the basement. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back and said something I have not forgotten. Entitlement grows fastest in houses people think they already own. He suggested, very gently, that before making any decision, I should know the home's current market value. When he said the number, nearly $800,000, I sat very still. Richard and I had once worried over mortgage payments that were less than our grocery bill became in later years, and now this house my daughter-in-law treated as her reward had become something else entirely, a lever. Driving home, I noticed for the first time how Melissa had begun changing the front landscaping, removing hostas I planted with Richard and replacing them with ornamental grasses she called cleaner, cleaner, as if memory were clutter. That evening she announced she was thinking of knocking out the upstairs sitting room wall to enlarge the suite, and asked whether I would mind if contractors came by next week. I smiled and told her she should not make expensive plans too quickly. She took it for an old woman's bitterness and laughed. After dinner I sat at the basement desk with a notepad and wrote down 3 things: appraisal, buyers, timeline. Not because I had chosen everything yet, but because once a woman begins naming her options, she is no longer trapped. Upstairs I heard Melissa tell Daniel that moving me downstairs had finally made the house function properly. I turned off the lamp and smiled in the dark, because for the first time since Richard died, I had begun to understand that control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it returns as paperwork. Melissa became almost cheerful in the days that followed, and that cheerfulness unsettled me more than cruelty ever had, because it carried the confidence of someone already spending money she did not possess. She began ordering sample fabrics delivered to the porch, long cardboard tubes leaning beside the umbrella stand. And one afternoon I returned from the grocery store to find a contractor in my kitchen discussing whether a wall upstairs was load-bearing. Melissa introduced him as if I were a guest in a house she managed, then asked whether I preferred warm white paint or antique cream for what she called the primary suite, a phrase so foreign in that old colonial that it sounded like trespass spoken aloud. I told her both colors looked expensive. She laughed and said it would all be worth it once the house reflected their taste, as though 40 years of mine had been provisional. What struck me most was Daniel's silence. Not hostile, simply vacant. The silence of a man allowing comfort to overrule conscience. On Sunday, my sister Lorraine stopped by unannounced with a lemon bundt cake and found me downstairs folding laundry. She stood at the bottom of the basement steps and stared so long I thought she might cry. But Lorraine had never been a woman who wasted emotion where anger would do. She asked, in a voice hard as glass, why I was sleeping beside canned peaches and furnace filters, and Melissa, hearing her, swept down the stairs explaining they had made improvements. For my safety, Lorraine looked around at the exposed ductwork and said, "If this is safety, prison architects should take notes." After Melissa left the room in offense, Lorraine sat beside me and said something I had been waiting for another person to see. This was not concern, it was displacement. She reminded me of small things I had ignored for years. Melissa steering holiday plans away from my traditions, convincing Daniel to refinance his car against my advice, suggesting I simplify my wardrobe because bright colors looked unbecoming at my age. All those little edits of a person until the original nearly disappears. Before leaving, Lorraine squeezed my hand and asked, almost casually, whether the house was still solely mine. When I nodded, she smiled in a way I recognized from childhood, the smile she wore before winning arguments adults thought children could not understand. That evening, Melissa announced she had invited neighbors to a wine and cheese gathering the following Friday to show people the updates, and in some cold private chamber of my mind, a clock began moving faster. The next morning, Harold sent over a comparative market packet and a handwritten note suggesting one discreet broker he trusted. I met that broker, Susan Keene, at a diner off Route 44 where truckers drank burnt coffee and no one cared who overheard what. Susan was brisk, silver-haired, and had sold houses through 3 recessions. When I told her I wanted a quiet sale, possibly off market, she studied me for a moment and said, "You are not downsizing. You are repositioning." I liked her instantly. She believed there might be buyers willing to move quickly because historic homes in our neighborhood rarely came available. When I returned home, Melissa was measuring the upstairs windows while humming to herself, and she barely noticed me pass. That night, lying awake in the basement, I heard laughter overhead from the room where Richard used to read biographies before sleep. And instead of sorrow, I felt distance, as if I were already leaving them behind. Just before dawn, my phone lit up with a message from Susan. Serious cash buyer interested. Wants private walkthrough. I stared at those words in the blue morning dark and understood the first crack in Melissa's certainty had already formed, though she was still upstairs choosing curtains. The private showing happened on a Thursday at 11, while Melissa believed I was at the pharmacy refilling a prescription, and I still remember how strange it felt to let strangers walk through the front door while the woman who acted like mistress of the house arranged flowers upstairs unaware. Susan arrived first, efficient as always, followed by a couple from Boston, Martin and Elise Porter, both in their 60s, the kind of people who touched old banisters with reverence instead of calculating resale. Elise paused in the front hall and admired the crown molding Richard restored by hand, and for the first time in weeks I felt something warm move through me, the relief of seeing my home regarded as legacy instead of prize. I showed them the sunroom where we once hosted Christmas Eve, the kitchen window where Daniel did homework as a boy, the upstairs bedroom Melissa had begun redesigning as if memory were removable wallpaper. When we stepped into that room, Elise ran her fingers over the uneven blue paper and said, "Please do not let anyone strip this. It belongs to the house." And I nearly laughed at the accidental prophecy. They asked whether I was certain about selling, and I heard myself say I was not leaving my home, only choosing who would honor it. Before they left, Martin made an offer nearly at asking, all cash, no contingencies beyond inspection, and Susan, after they drove away, looked at me and said we might have something extraordinary. I signed. Nothing that day, but I felt the current changing. Returning home before Melissa noticed my absence, I found her hosting 2 women from church in the living room, giving them a tour of what she called our renovation vision. She lowered her voice when she saw me, but not before I heard one of them ask whether it was difficult having an elderly parent in the home. Elderly parent. I carried tea into the room and answered before Melissa could, saying some burdens teach people exactly who they are. One of the women looked uncomfortable. Melissa smiled too brightly. Afterward, she accused me of embarrassing her, and there it was, another veil dropped. Not concern, not family stewardship, but image. Later that night, Daniel came downstairs and sat on the edge of the basement bed, a gesture almost childlike, and asked whether I was unhappy. I wanted to tell him unhappiness had long ago passed into something more precise. But instead I asked whether he remembered sanding floors beside his father one summer when he was 14. He smiled faintly and said yes. I told him houses remember who honors them. He looked puzzled, perhaps sensing meaning moving just beyond reach. The next morning, Susan called to say the Porters wanted a second walkthrough and were willing to increase the offer if I included certain antique light fixtures Richard restored. I agreed. By afternoon, Melissa was speaking excitedly about hosting Thanksgiving in the expanded upstairs suite and whether they should remove the old cedar chest from what she now considered their room. Their room. Every time she said it, she tightened the knot she did not know was around her own future. That weekend, while she and Daniel drove to a furniture outlet 2 towns over, Susan brought the Porters back through the house, and at the dining room table where my family once celebrated graduations and anniversaries, I signed the purchase agreement. The pen felt unexpectedly light. Afterward, I sat alone listening to the refrigerator hum and thought of Richard's habit of tapping documents twice before declaring business done. I tapped the contract twice myself. When Melissa returned, she was flushed with excitement over a bedroom set she had put on store credit, and as she described carved headboards and imported linen, I folded the signed contract into my purse and realized the most dangerous illusions are the ones greed furnishes in advance. The inspection came 5 days later, and fate, with its quiet sense of irony, chose that morning to let Melissa reveal more than she intended. Because Susan presented the Porters as preservation consultants interested in architectural details, Melissa assumed they were allies to her renovation fantasies and spent half the tour boasting about what she planned to change once the house was fully ours. Words she said so casually she did not notice Martin glanced toward me. She spoke of removing Richard's built-in bookcases, converting the sunroom into a cocktail lounge, even replacing the old rose arbor I planted after Daniel was born because she said it looked dated. Every sentence was another layer peeled back, not by accusation but by vanity. Then came the moment I still think of as the first public fracture in her performance. The inspector asked about a newly installed electrical line feeding the upstairs wall sconces Melissa had ordered, and when he requested permit records, she waved a hand and said Daniel handled all that, though Daniel, standing there with a clipboard he did not understand, looked startled. By afternoon, the inspector informed Susan those alterations had not been properly permitted and might require correction before closing, unless liability remained with current occupants after transfer. Susan later explained this could become costly, and I remember thinking how often arrogance writes invoices in invisible ink. That evening Melissa was irritated, snapping over dinner that bureaucrats complicate everything, then casually mentioned she had opened a home furnishings line of credit assuming they would soon have equity breathing room. Daniel looked confused and asked what equity she meant. She answered as if speaking to a child, "The house, of course." I kept buttering my roll and said nothing. 2 days later, Harold invited me to his office for final review, where he recommended we keep the closing date discreet until funds were secure. He also mentioned, with lawyerly delicacy, that Melissa's signed contractor forms claiming owner authorization could expose her personally if disputed work became an issue. I did not ask for consequences. Consequences were already walking toward her on their own feet. When I returned home, Lorraine was waiting in the driveway and handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was Richard's old fountain pen, the one he used to sign the original mortgage papers. "For your next signature," she said. I nearly cried then, but some emotions at my age do not rise outward. They deepen inward. Meanwhile, Melissa had grown almost triumphant, hosting another gathering where she referred to me, within my hearing, as someone who had finally accepted the transition, accepted, as though surrender and strategy were twins. What she did not know was Susan had already scheduled closing for the following week, and the wire instructions sat folded inside my Bible downstairs. That Friday night, Daniel came to the basement again, uneasy, asking whether I thought families can recover from misunderstandings. I looked at my son and saw not villainy but weakness shaped over years by avoiding discomfort. I told him families recover from mistakes, not from entitlement protected too long. He asked what I meant, but footsteps sounded above, and he drifted back upstairs before I answered. Later, I heard Melissa on the phone telling a friend she had found the perfect imported bedroom set and would order it once the old chapter fully closes. I lay awake smiling at that phrase because she was right in one way she could not imagine. An old chapter was closing, only not the one she believed. On Monday, Susan called just after dawn and said the funds would clear sooner than expected, and the Porters wanted possession accelerated by 10 days. Accelerated. The word carried the clean force of a train leaving the station. I looked around the basement at storage boxes, furnace pipes, the narrow bed they thought had diminished me, and realized the room had served its purpose. It had not been my exile. It had been my war room. The closing was scheduled for Wednesday at 10 in the morning, but the true unraveling began the night before, when Melissa came downstairs carrying fabric samples and asked whether I would mind moving a few storage boxes because a delivery crew was bringing the new bedroom furniture on Saturday. Saturday, she said, with the easy entitlement of someone arranging a future she believed guaranteed. I looked at the swatches in her hand, pale linen and muted sage, and thought how strange it was that conquest so often arrives decorated. I told her Saturday might bring surprises. She laughed as though I had made an old woman's joke. That same night, Susan called to confirm wire instructions and whispered, almost amused, that the Porters had requested one item remain with the sale because they had fallen in love with it, Richard's crooked blue wallpaper. Some victories arrive so quietly you almost miss they are victories at all. The next morning I drove to Harold's office in my navy wool coat, carrying Richard's fountain pen in my purse, and when I signed the final transfer papers, I felt no triumph, only steadiness, as if something bent long ago had at last returned upright. The funds cleared before lunch. By 1 o'clock the deed was recorded. By 1:30 I sat in a diner booth with Susan eating chicken soup, while she slid a cashier's statement across the table showing the proceeds after taxes and fees. I stared at the figure for a long while, not because of the money, but because every dollar represented freedom Melissa had mistaken for inheritance. Back at the house, she was bustling through the dining room planning Friday's wine gathering, discussing imported cheeses and whether the old silver should be polished, while Daniel reviewed credit card statements at the kitchen island with a furrow in his brow. I learned then she had charged nearly $18,000 in furnishings tied to the renovation. Debt built on fantasy. Around dusk, a courier delivered a thick envelope requiring my signature. Melissa intercepted it, saw the law office return address, and asked what Harold Benton wanted. I said estate housekeeping. She accepted that too easily. Another small gift pride gives the patient. After dinner, Daniel mentioned a furniture financing call had asked for proof of projected home equity, and he did not understand why. Melissa brushed him off and changed the subject to paint colors. Watching them, I realized greed rarely notices when the floor beneath it has already been sold. Later, while folding sweaters downstairs, I heard raised voices overhead. The first real argument in years. Daniel asking why she had assumed they could leverage the property. Melissa insisting everything would be theirs eventually. The word eventually ringing through the vents like confession. I sat very still and let their marriage begin teaching them what I no longer needed to explain. Thursday morning, Harold telephoned with one final matter. Because of the unpermitted electrical work and representations Melissa signed, the buyers were requiring a credit holdback tied specifically to those defects, funds Daniel and Melissa might owe if corrections exceeded escrow. Financial consequences. Neat and unemotional. Law has a colder poetry than revenge. By afternoon, Susan texted that the Porters wished to move possession forward even faster and would arrive with the attorney Monday morning to present occupancy notice. Monday. Only 4 days away. That evening, Melissa invited neighbors for her gathering and toasted new chapters. Standing in my dining room beneath the chandelier, Richard rewired himself, smiling like a woman already crowned. One guest asked whether I would be moving to assisted living now that the younger generation was taking over, and before Melissa could answer, I said, very calmly, sometimes generations misunderstand who is taking over until documents arrive. A hush followed, brief but sharp. Melissa laughed too loudly and changed the subject, but I saw one neighbor studying me with sudden curiosity, as though sensing weather shift. That night, I packed one suitcase, only what I truly wanted to carry into a new life, and placed it beside the basement door. Then I turned out the lamp and listened to the furnace hum, thinking how extraordinary it was that the room they meant as my ending had become the place from which I quietly removed their future. Monday arrived bright and almost offensively beautiful, one of those early autumn mornings when sunlight makes old clapboard houses look forgiving, and I remember thinking betrayal prefers ordinary weather because no one expects a life to split open under a blue sky. Melissa was in the kitchen arranging grapes on a serving board for an afternoon luncheon she still intended to host, humming as if the world were aligned to her plans, while Daniel sat distracted over coffee staring at a credit statement he had not shown me. Just after 10, a sedan pulled into the driveway, followed by a moving truck sooner than either of them could have imagined, and when Melissa glanced through the lace curtain she frowned, assuming perhaps a delivery had arrived early. The doorbell rang. I opened it before she could. Susan stood there beside Harold and the Porters, all composed in that almost ceremonial way people carry themselves when facts have already hardened. Melissa's smile froze as Martin Porter stepped forward and introduced himself again, not as consultant this time but owner. Owner. Some words do not need volume to land with force. Harold handed Daniel a packet and explained the sale had closed, possession transferred, and formal occupancy notice began today. Daniel read the first page twice as if language itself had become unreliable. Melissa laughed, thin and desperate, saying this had to be some mistake, that no house could be sold without family consent, and Harold, with lawyerly gentleness, replied consent had been obtained from the only legal owner. There are moments when masks do not fall so much as dissolve, and I watched hers disappear. She turned to Daniel demanding he say something, deny something, reverse something, but he was pale with the dawning terror of a man discovering assumptions are not rights. Then came the second blow, colder than the first. Harold informed them the buyers had elected to enforce correction liability tied to unauthorized electrical modifications and false owner representations, and escrow holdbacks would not cover all projected costs. Melissa whispered what costs, and Susan named a figure large enough to silence the room. Financial punishment has a particular stillness. It does not shout, it settles. What followed was not drama but exposure. One of the luncheon guests arrived early and walked into the foyer just as Melissa accused me of betrayal, only to hear Harold calmly explain the property had been mine alone all along. By noon, 3 neighbors knew exactly why the luncheon had dissolved, and by evening the story had traveled farther than Melissa's reputation could outrun. Daniel finally asked why I had not warned him, and I answered because warnings had been given the day my bed was moved downstairs. He looked stricken, older somehow. Melissa demanded where they were supposed to go, and Martin Porter, not unkindly, pointed out they had 30 days and perhaps should begin by canceling the imported furniture. I almost admired the precision of that irony. Then, with a trembling anger born more of humiliation than remorse, Melissa called me cruel. After months beside a furnace in a basement, she called cozy. I stepped closer and said the cruel act was not selling a house, but teaching a mother she was a guest in the home she paid for. No one answered. Silence, when earned, can feel like verdict. As movers began measuring rooms, I carried my single suitcase to my car while Lorraine pulled into the driveway to follow me north to the lake cottage. Daniel came outside and asked if there was anything left to salvage between us. I told him relationships can survive poverty, grief, even mistakes, but rarely survive entitlement once defended. He wept then, quietly, like the boy who once sanded floors beside his father, and for a flicker I mourned what weakness had made of him. But mourning is not surrender. As I drove away, I looked once in the mirror and saw Melissa standing on the porch of a house she no longer possessed, holding papers she should have read sooner. She had moved me to the margins and believed the story ended there. Instead, she had given me the one thing dangerous people should never give a patient woman with a deed, a reason. The lake cottage sat 90 miles north on a narrow road lined with birch trees, and when Lorraine followed me there that afternoon, she stood on the porch looking over the water and said it felt like a place where women come to remember who they are. I slept that first night in a bedroom upstairs with morning light falling across a quilt my mother stitched decades ago, and I woke before dawn from habit, half expecting to hear footsteps overhead, then smiled when all I heard was loons out on the lake and the old radiator clicking itself warm. Freedom, I learned, has sounds. For several days I said little to anyone except Susan, Harold, and Lorraine, letting the old house settle into other hands while the consequences I had set in motion found their own rhythm. Martin Porter called to tell me Melissa had tried, twice, to challenge the sale through bluster disguised as legal threat, only to be reminded by counsel that recorded deeds are indifferent to outrage. He also told me the electrical corrections exceeded escrow and Daniel had been forced to liquidate an investment account to cover the balance. I sat on my porch hearing this with no pleasure, only a sober sense of balance restored. Meanwhile, gossip, that ancient American tribunal, moved faster than paperwork. One of Melissa's church friends learned she had moved me into the basement before attempting to claim the house as social inheritance, and by the following Sunday Melissa found herself politely excluded from a charity committee she once chaired. Reputation can leave through the same front door pride entered. A week later, Daniel drove up unannounced in a wrinkled shirt I had ironed for him years ago when he interviewed for his first job, and he looked not broken but stripped of pretense. We sat by the water, and he admitted the furniture orders had been canceled at a loss. The rental they secured was half the size they expected, and Melissa blamed him now for not verifying ownership long before. I listened, then asked whether blame had yet made him honest. After a long silence, he said he had begun to see how often silence had been his form of betrayal. It was the first true thing he had said in months. He asked whether I had planned every detail from the moment they moved me downstairs, and I told him no. I only began by refusing to confuse humiliation with helplessness. He wept a little then, not dramatically, just enough to show boyhood still survived inside middle age. Before leaving, he handed me a small box he found in the old cedar chest Melissa wanted removed. Inside was Richard's pocket compass. tarnished but working. Dad would have admired what you did, he said. Perhaps he would have. Perhaps he taught me. More than I knew. After Daniel left, Susan phoned with a final absurd twist. The imported bedroom set Melissa ordered on credit had been delivered to the old address after possession transferred, and because return fees were refused under contract, she had to absorb the cost for furniture meant for a room she never owned. Even objects, it seemed, had joined the verdict. Autumn deepened. I planted mums by the cottage steps and arranged my accounts with a financial advisor Harold recommended, securing enough income that no one would ever again speak to me as though my future depended on their convenience. One crisp morning, I drove past the old neighborhood and saw the porters preserving the rose arbor Melissa wanted torn out, Elise kneeling in gardening gloves where I once knelt with Richard, and something inside me softened into peace. The house had not been lost, only rescued from the wrong inheritance. Weeks later, Daniel called to say he had moved into a separate apartment while Melissa stayed with her sister, their marriage bent under debts and truths neither could unhear. I did not rejoice. Consequences need no audience. As winter settled over the lake, I would sometimes stand at the upstairs window of my cottage and think about the basement room, the concrete walls, the furnace hum, the narrow bed they thought reduced me. They never understood that was the room where their illusion died. They believed they pushed me below the household and made me smaller, but what they really did was force me to remember that ownership is not only about property, but about deciding when enough disrespect has been mistaken for duty. And once a woman remembers that, the story no longer belongs to those who tried to write her out of it. Winter came hard that year. The lake rimmed with ice by December, and with the season came a quiet I had not known in decades, the kind that lets memory settle into something wiser than pain. I had nearly convinced myself the story had reached its natural ending when Lorraine called one Tuesday morning and said there was something I ought to hear before it reached me through gossip. And in her voice I recognized the tone reserved for truths too sharp for small talk. Melissa, it seemed, had tried one final maneuver. She had been telling people at church and among Daniel's colleagues that I had manipulated a grieving son, that I sold the house in confusion, even that I had been influenced by outsiders for financial gain. Old accusations dressed in respectable clothes, but vanity often overreaches, and hers did when she repeated those claims to a woman whose brother sat on the same real estate ethics board where Harold occasionally lectured. By week's end, she received a formal warning after inquiries exposed her false owner representations on permit filings and contradictions in statements she made regarding the property. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, just the quiet humiliation of official scrutiny where she had once relied on charm. The same week Daniel called and asked whether I would meet him halfway for lunch. We met at a roadside inn near the state line where truckers parked beside lawyers in winter coats, and he looked thinner. The confidence of inherited comfort burned off him. Over chicken pot pie, he told me he had filed for legal separation, not because of the house alone, but because the sale forced him to confront years of compromise he called love. He admitted Melissa had opened additional lines of credit using projections tied to the home. Debts now solely hers after their attorneys divided obligations. Financial ruin may be too grand a phrase, but hardship had certainly found her. She had taken a job at a furniture showroom an hour away, ironic enough to make Lorraine laugh for a week. Daniel then did something I had not expected. He slid across the table an envelope containing a notarized statement relinquishing any future claim, however symbolic, to the proceeds from the house and acknowledging publicly that the property had always been mine alone. I should have said this before everyone, he told me, but I am saying it now. Some apologies do not erase injury, but they return dignity where silence once stole it. In January, the church newsletter printed a bland little note announcing committee leadership changes, but among women who have lived long enough, translation comes easily. Melissa's social standing, once polished like silver, had dulled beyond repair, yet what mattered more arrived later, when Harold visited the cottage with estate revisions I requested, placing everything into a charitable trust supporting housing assistance for widowed women. You are turning injury into structure, he said, and I liked that. Not revenge, structure. Weeks passed. One snowy afternoon, I received a package from the porters containing a framed photograph of the old blue bedroom preserved exactly as Richard left it, with a note that read, "The room remembers you." I set it by my fireplace and understood then the story was not about losing a bedroom or selling a house, but about refusing demotion in any form. In early spring, Daniel visited again, this time with tools to repair my dock, and as we worked he said he used to think adulthood meant inheriting a house, but now believed it meant deserving one. I told him that was the first sensible inheritance he had ever claimed. As for Melissa, the last I heard she moved to a smaller apartment above a bakery, still paying down debts tied to furniture ordered for a master suite she never slept in. People ask whether I ever regretted acting so decisively, and I always think of the basement, the concrete floor cold beneath my slippers, the way they framed exile as convenience. Regret belongs to those who surrendered too long. I did not merely regain control of my property, I reclaimed authorship over the story they tried to assign me. The woman they sent downstairs ended up with a lake house, financial security, legal authority intact, a son forced into truth, a daughter-in-law unmasked before the very society she once courted, and a legacy redirected by her own hand. They believed moving my bed changed my place in the family. What it changed was who held power, and once that changed, everything else followed. Spring arrived with a softness that made the lake shine like hammered silver, and by then I had begun to believe life after betrayal might be less about recovery than redesign. I spent mornings tending herbs in window boxes and afternoons helping Harold structure the housing trust, and each small practical act felt like a rebuttal to the old story in which age meant dependency. Then one Friday in May, Daniel called with a strained voice and asked whether I would attend a mediation session. Because Melissa, through her attorney, wanted to contest liability for the unpermitted electrical work and implied Daniel had acted under my influence when signing settlement acknowledgments. Even after everything, she was still trying to turn truth into fog. I almost refused, but Harold said sometimes the cleanest ending requires witnesses. The mediation took place in a modest office park conference room with weak coffee and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly more tired than they were. Melissa arrived in a cream suit that seemed chosen for dignity, though strain showed in the careful set of her mouth. For a moment I saw not villain but a woman cornered by her own appetite. But sympathy does not require surrender. Her attorney argued she believed improvements were family authorized and had relied on expectations of future occupancy. Expectations, not rights. Harold responded by sliding across the table copies of the deed, contractor forms bearing her signatures as owner representative, and, at my request, a notarized statement from Daniel admitting he had allowed me to be displaced without objection. Paper can be merciless. When the mediator asked whether I wished to pursue damages for misrepresentation linked to unauthorized alterations, the room went still. Melissa looked at me with something between fear and appeal, and in that silence I understood power is not proven by crushing someone, but by choosing the exact weight justice requires. I declined damages beyond existing liability, but insisted all corrective costs remain hers and that a written acknowledgement be entered withdrawing any claim that I acted incompetently or under coercion. Her face blanched. Financial consequence had already found her, but public correction was the wound pride feels most. She signed. When the mediator asked whether either party wished to add anything, I heard myself say, calmly, "You moved a widow into a basement for convenience and called it care. Do not ever confuse my restraint for confusion again." No one spoke for several seconds. Even Harold looked at me with a kind of quiet respect. Afterward, in the parking lot, Daniel embraced me, awkwardly, as though relearning how sons stand beside mothers, and said hearing me speak felt like hearing his father in the room. Perhaps that was the highest vindication I had not known I still wanted. Within a month, Melissa's appeal options were exhausted. Her remaining credit line was reportedly frozen during debt restructuring, and the ethics warning attached to her permit representations followed her into a professional licensing review tied to a side consulting credential she once bragged about. She did not go to jail. Life is rarely theatrical that way, but she paid in money, reputation, and the slow collapse of every image she built on borrowed authority. Meanwhile, the trust launched its first grant to a widow facing eviction, and when I signed those papers with Richard's fountain pen, I realized the house had done one final thing for me after being sold. It had multiplied into shelter for others. One June afternoon, Daniel helped me install a brass plaque by the cottage door that read Harper House North. A joke, perhaps, but also a reclamation. Later we sat on the dock, and he asked whether I ever hated Melissa. I told him hatred is too intimate a bond for someone whose lesson is already complete. What I felt was closure. The woman who had measured curtains for my bedroom now measured repayment schedules. The son who once looked away had learned the cost of looking away, and I, who had been tucked beside a furnace as though nearing irrelevance, now controlled more assets, more purpose, and more peace than at any point since widowhood began. People sometimes think the climax of a story is the moment the house was sold, but it was not. The true climax was the day the woman they underestimated sat at a conference table, refused erasure, forced a written correction of lies, and left with law, dignity, and legacy aligned on her side. After that, everything was not revenge. It was order. By late summer, the trust had funded 3 women in temporary housing, and each time Harold mailed me a report, I would sit on the porch reading numbers that no longer looked like finance to me, but consequence turned useful. There is a special peace in watching injury become shelter. Daniel came north almost every other weekend then, sometimes to mend the dock, sometimes just to sit in the old Adirondack chairs and speak more honestly than he ever had under his own roof. One evening, he told me the divorce papers had been filed and that Melissa, after months of insisting she had been wronged, finally admitted in mediation with her own counsel that she had treated inheritance as entitlement. I did not ask whether remorse was genuine, because regret that arrives after collapse belongs partly to survival. What mattered was that the lie had stopped breeding. A week later, something unexpected happened. I received a handwritten note forwarded through Harold's office from Melissa herself. No theatrics, no self-pity, only 6 pages in careful blue ink acknowledging she had mistaken my patience for weakness and my widowhood for surrender. She wrote that the basement decision began, in her mind, as practical convenience, but became something uglier once possession felt possible. Greed rarely introduces itself honestly. She asked for nothing, not forgiveness, not money, not reunion, only that I know she finally understood why losing the house was not punishment but exposure. I read the letter twice and placed it in the drawer beside Richard's compass. Some confessions are not meant to reopen doors, only to close them properly. That autumn, Daniel and I drove together to the old neighborhood because the Porters invited us for cider beneath the rose arbor, now thriving again. Walking through the house, I felt no ache, only astonishment at how completely a place can remain yours in memory without remaining yours in law. The crooked blue wallpaper still held. Elise had framed one strip preserved from a repair and hung it in the hall like folk art. When Daniel stood in the upstairs room he once seated so carelessly, he whispered, "I cannot believe I let her move you out of here." I answered what I had come to believe, that betrayal often begins not with cruelty, but with the cowardice of small permissions. He nodded as if carrying that sentence somewhere permanent. Before leaving, Martin took me aside and said the story of the sale had become neighborhood legend, told half in admiration and half in warning. I laughed at that, because old women are rarely granted the luxury of becoming cautionary tales to the entitled. On the drive back, Daniel asked whether I would ever consider rewriting my will to return some of the proceeds to him. A year earlier, the question might have cut me. Instead, I smiled and told him the trust was already my answer, because legacy should favor those who need protection, not those who once presumed ownership. He looked thoughtful, then said he agreed. And in that moment, I understood. He had finally stepped out from under the long shadow of convenience. Winter approached again, nearly a full cycle since the basement room, and I marked the anniversary not with grief, but with a dinner at the cottage for Lorraine, Harold, Susan, and Daniel. I served pot roast, the same meal from the night my exile was announced, and halfway through dessert Daniel raised a glass and said, "To the woman who was sent downstairs and ended up above us all." Even Harold laughed at that. Later, after everyone left, I stood alone at the upstairs window overlooking moonlight on the lake and thought of the strange geometry of justice. Melissa had lost money, status, marriage, and illusion. Daniel had lost comfort but regained character. I had lost a bedroom only to gain authority over the rest of my life. And still I sensed one thing remained unfinished, not in conflict but in meaning. The Trust's board had proposed naming its housing initiative after me, which embarrassed me until Lorraine said names matter because they teach memory where to live. So when the papers arrived, I signed them simply Evelyn's Place. The woman they tried to relocate had become an address others could turn toward, and as I sealed that envelope with Richard's fountain pen, I realized the story was no longer about what they did to me, but about what survived them. The dedication ceremony for Evelyn's Place was held the following spring in a modest brick community center 40 miles south of the lake, and if anyone had told me a year earlier that the woman sent to sleep beside a furnace would one day stand at a podium funding shelter for widows, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. Yet there I was in a navy suit, Richard's fountain pen in my handbag, Daniel seated in the front row, Harold beside the county housing director, and a brass plaque draped in blue cloth waiting to be unveiled. What I did not know until that morning was that the event would carry one final reckoning no courtroom could have staged better. Because among those attending was the chair of the licensing review board that had been examining Melissa's professional misrepresentations, tied to permit filings and false ownership declarations, and before the luncheon began, Harold quietly told me the board had issued its decision. Her consulting credential was formally revoked, restitution tied to the property misstatements had been ordered complete, and the disciplinary finding would remain public record. Not scandal, not spectacle, but a permanent mark where she once prized social polish most. Financial penalties had already hollowed out her ambitions, her reputation in church and civic circles had withered, and now the last borrowed authority she clung to was gone. As if that were not enough, Daniel leaned over before the speeches and handed me a folded newspaper clipping from the local business journal noting Melissa's appeal had failed and her debt restructuring had entered supervised repayment. Every avenue she believed could restore the old illusion had closed. Consequences had not merely visited. They had moved in. Then came the ceremony itself, the housing. Director spoke about older women displaced through family coercion, and when she introduced the trust as founded by a widow who turned personal betrayal into public protection, the room stood. I am not ashamed to say my eyes stung. When I stepped to the podium, I looked at rows of women who had known eviction, abandonment, quiet humiliations too familiar to explain, and I said only what felt true, that no person becomes small because others treat them as inconvenient. They become powerful the moment they stop consenting to disrespect disguised as duty. Afterward, Daniel unveiled the plaque, Evelyn's Place, and beneath it a line Harold had added without telling me. Dignity is not inherited. It is defended. There was a murmur in the room when people read it, the kind that tells you a sentence has landed beyond politeness. After lunch, while guests lingered, I saw Melissa standing alone near the back wall. I had not known she was coming. She looked older, not from age but from reckoning. She approached, not dramatic, simply humbled, and said she wanted to congratulate me because the woman she tried to diminish had become impossible to diminish. Then, in a gesture more public than any apology letter, she asked whether she might donate the proceeds from selling jewelry she once bought on those credit lines toward the trust. I looked at Harold, then at her, and said the trust accepts restitution in many forms. She wrote the check that afternoon. Not large enough to matter financially, but large enough to matter morally. Several women witnessed it. So yes, the woman who had once moved my bed downstairs ended by funding beds for widows she would never meet. If that is not poetic justice, I do not know what is. Later that evening, Daniel and I drove back to the lake, and as we crossed the county line, he told me he had amended his own estate plans to include housing charities, saying he wanted his inheritance to begin where my lesson began. My son, who once mistook silence for peace, had become a man who understood stewardship. That was a deeper victory than property ever was. Weeks later, the trust purchased its first duplex for transitional housing and named one apartment Richard House. I stood in the doorway at the ribbon cutting and ran my hand along fresh paint, thinking of blue wallpaper, furnace pipes, basement concrete, all the strange roads dignity sometimes takes, And here is the truth of how it ended, because endings matter. Melissa paid financially, publicly, professionally. Her ambition built on my erasure collapsed in plain sight and left a record no charm could rewrite. Daniel lost a marriage built on convenience and gained a conscience he now lives by. I retained every dollar law gave me, transformed the sale into lasting power, reclaimed social standing, shaped a charitable legacy, and turned the very wound meant to reduce me into a structure that will outlive us all. The house they thought they were quietly taking became the instrument of their exposure and my elevation. They moved me to a basement believing they had lowered my place in the family. In the end, I sold the house, stripped greed of its disguise, made the woman who displaced me fund the cause born from her own misconduct, restored my son through truth, and put my name above doors that shelter other women. No appeal reversed it. No rumor softened it. No one took back what I reclaimed. I did not get even. I ended up above. And that, at 72, was not revenge. It was victory.